Start the program. Good evening. I'm John Mika, the president of Founding Forward, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's very special Civil War Roundtable. A few housekeeping items before we begin. If everyone would take a moment, please, to silence, or even better, turn off your cell phone. I'd greatly appreciate that. We will have a Q&A towards the end of the program, and we will moderate that with microphones. So staff will come through with microphones. Just raise your hand. We'll get to as many questions as we can. Please do use the microphone as we are streaming and recording. And we want to be able to hear both in this room and for all posterity. And also, as always, just a reminder, a question should be a couple of sentences. And if you can't put a question mark at the end of those sentences, you have failed. So we're going to trust you with the microphones this evening. As you know, Founding Forward is a civic education organization, and we are now, I think without question, the fastest growing civic education organization in the United States. And that is made possible, thank you, through the generosity of you and others who want to see us succeed in changing the way Americans think about their country and their rights and responsibilities of American citizenship. And while civics education specifically is our growth area, we have not forgotten our roots. We are founded during the American Civil War. We are founded to support Abraham Lincoln, abolition, and Lincoln, and we have one of the great collections. And that collection is also growing. And tonight's program is inspired by some of that new collection. And I want to recognize the couple that made the acquisition of this collection possible. They are longtime League members, and in the case of John, chair of our collections committee for many, many years. But this collection that Professor Holzer will talk about was really made possible through the generosity and leadership of Mr. Jon and Karen Sirlin. Thank you. Thank you. And appropriately to introduce our program tonight is the one and only my friend, our benefactor for the evening, Mr. Jon Sirlin. John.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It wasn't as good as the one I wrote about myself, but then again, what can you do? I met Professor Holzer a few months ago, and we hit it off right away. We spent several hours with our archivist, Keeley, in the archives looking at the collection and other treasures of the Union League. We had a great time. And then we met my wife, Karen, up at Trumbauer's for a 3.5-hour dinner and closed the restaurant. So we had a wonderful time. And I was very impressed with Harold, the scope of his career. He's not only the historian that you've come to hear, but he's had successful careers in politics, in journalism, in entertainment, and something else which I forgot. But he's got so many things. And then I realized that they had said to me, you know, we know that you go off on ad libs, so just stick with the script. So I guess I better read what I was told to read in the first place, so I'll put on my glasses and tell you about Harold Holzer. Harold Holzer is the winner of the 2015 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, is one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. His recent books on Lincoln include The Annotated Lincoln and A Just and Generous Nation, Abraham Lincoln and the Fight for American Opportunity. A prolific writer and lecturer and frequent guest on television, Holzer served for 6 years as chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation. For 10 years, he co-chaired the congressionally created U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. President Bush awarded Holzer the National Humanities Medal in 2008. In 2013, Holzer wrote an essay on Lincoln for the official program at the re-inauguration of President Obama. He is now chairman of the Lincoln Forum. Founding Forward is honored to welcome Harold Holzer.
Thank you, John. And he forgot to say that the reason we lingered here for 3.5 hours was that it was the Union League seafood buffet, which was worth savoring, I have to tell you. Well, it's an honor to be back here. Boy, this group looks fabulous. It does. It's great to be here. I've been studying and writing about Lincoln and Lincoln art for about 50 years now. And I will always remember the early and generous and sustained help and advice I got here at the Union League from scholars and from members guiding me through the collections for the first time, giving me literature. And in recent years, I've had the same kind of friendship and access thanks to John Miko and Keely Tullio, who you just heard about, from both of whom I've received a continuing flow of information, not to mention invitations like this to talk about what I've learned here, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm speaking based on that 5-hour foray I had into the new acquisitions that the Sirlins made possible here at Founding Forward and the Union League. So here goes. Let me start with the date. I hate starting with the date, but I think in a few minutes you'll understand why I'm doing it. So the date is March 27th, 1863. This is total, oh, there we go. There we go. And that's the day, the subject of tonight's talk, Jakob Otto Schweizer was born in Zurich. So why do I mention that exact moment? Because on the very day that Schweitzer was born, across the ocean in Washington, D.C., a local artist, a Philadelphia artist, named Edward Dalton Marchant, and that's his self-portrait, was working in the White House, painting a portrait of the same subject that Schweitzer would tackle half a century later, Abraham Lincoln. I heard some of you whisper Marchant and all the other pronunciations. I was told by a family member about 8 years ago that it's Marchant. So I'm going to keep saying Marchant. Everybody else is going to correct me, but that's okay. It may be Marchant at this point, but I think originally he dropped the French pronunciation to sound more American. Well, you all know, I guess, the picture I'm referring to. It's right upstairs. It's this painting of Lincoln as an emancipator, painted from life. And just think, it was being painted from life on the very birthday of the sculptor who 213 years later would craft the Lincoln statue that we are all here to celebrate and learn more about today. 2 works of art that span half a century of commitment by the Union League, think about it, to commemorating Abraham Lincoln. And that span is now more than a century and a half of commitment. And if that's not enough to highlight the coincidences around presidential portraiture, think of this. Marchant's first teacher was Gilbert Stuart, the artist who painted George Washington from life rather famously. So it's quite a tradition, from the founder of the country to the savior of the country, to the martyr of the country, the great orator who Schweitzer later portrayed. So let me start with a bit about Marchant, because how can we not address his work first when it's, well, I think the jewel in the crown of the great art collection here, certainly one of them. But its origins remain a little bit tangled. We think a group of Union League members, actually, from the newly formed club, commissioned the painting soon after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Right away, for the old building, the original building, the founding members looking forward, right, founding forward, they wanted a picture of Abraham Lincoln. So in hiring Marchant, who was 56 years old, a little older than Lincoln, they got one of the best-known artists in the city. To make sure he got access, they sent him down to Washington with a letter of introduction from someone who knew Lincoln, the publisher of the pro-administration newspaper, the Washington Chronicle, who happened to be from Philadelphia, John Forney. And this is what the letter said. The bearer, Mr. E.D. Marchant, the eminent artist, has been empowered by a large body of your personal and political friends to paint your picture for the Hall of American Independence. A generous subscription is made, and he visits you to ask your acquiescence. He will need little of your time. There is no likeness of you at Independence Hall. It should be there. And as Mr. Marchant is a most distinguished artist and is commanded by the most powerful influences, I trust you will give him a favorable impression. So things get a little murky from there. Was Lincoln meant to believe that the painting would grace Independence Hall permanently, or just hang there for a brief exhibit and then be transferred to the patron's home organization at the Union League? Because Forney mentions Independence Hall twice in that letter. If I was Lincoln, I would think, oh, my picture is going to hang alongside those of the founders in Independence Hall. And I actually think that's one of the reasons, all due respect to the Union League, which is a new movement at that time, brand new movement, I think one of the reasons he said yes to Marchant, because he wasn't that obliging to painters who came with requests, is that he loved the idea of having his portrait on view at Independence Hall. Remember, Lincoln had raised the flag at Independence Hall 2 years earlier. And I think I get to use, I said I wouldn't use the, but of course I don't know how to use it. Oh, here. There, see the guy with the hat here? That's Abraham Lincoln on the platform. It was Washington's birthday, 1861. Lincoln was en route to his inaugural. He knew that an assassination plot awaited him in Baltimore. He'd been told it by two different sources in his hotel here in Philadelphia. But in public, on that platform, raising a flag with 34 stars, defiantly, Kansas added and nothing subtracted. Forget South Carolina, forget all of them. It's a full union here at Independence Hall. And he says, I would rather be assassinated on this spot than to surrender it. Not because he had foreshadowings of 1865, but because he was under threat. And he would sneak through Baltimore to avoid that plot. Slavery and secession had made him realize, he told the crowd, and this is something to keep in mind as we celebrate America's 250th, Lincoln was celebrating throughout his presidency. I've never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln said, giving liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. So I think, thinking of his time in Philadelphia, he had been here only once before as a younger man. Thinking of Independence Hall, and there he is in front of Independence Hall, he welcomed Marchant to the White House, gave him 4 months of on and off sittings to paint him there. We often marvel, at least those of us who think about Lincoln art all the time like I do, marvel at the fact that Lincoln gave another artist, Francis Carpenter of New York, 6 months to do his Emancipation Proclamation canvas the following year. But devoting 4 months is pretty remarkable too, because before Marchant, Lincoln had never given a painter or sculptor more than a couple of days to work on a portrait. Lincoln even granted Marchant an additional favor, which I think is the most fascinating and humanizing story behind the painting you have upstairs. He got a pass from the 23rd Pennsylvania Volunteers so that the artist's son, Captain Henry Marchant, could, quote, assist his father in the work, but no doubt principally to facilitate a temporary reunion between father and child. And there's his original letter, giving Marchant a pass to come and work in the White House. And when work progressed slowly, Lincoln even asked General Meade to extend the leave so he can stay longer. So this is a 24-year-old young man. I have never found any evidence that he was a junior painter to his father, that in fact he knew anything about painting. I'm certain that his presence would be what the painter would remember for the rest of his years, even more than his experience with Lincoln. And why? Because Lincoln's generous order for a leave of absence for young Henry gave father and son their final days together. When Henry returned to the ranks, he was ordered into the Battle of Chancellorsville, and that's just a few months later, and that's where he died. So what his father publicly remembered, he never talked about losing his son, was how hard it was to depict Lincoln. I was in daily communication with this remarkable man, more a labor of love than I have ever been permitted to perform. But he was seldom twice alike. His features of endless variety, the most difficult subject who ever taxed my skills as an artist. Every artist who painted Lincoln made the same observation. From the time he won the nomination for president till February, a couple of months before he died. It was hard to capture his expression. He laughed one minute, he lapsed into melancholy the second. And what many of the artists did is commission a photograph so they could fix an expression that they could portray, because he just moved around and changed expression too much. And Marchant did the same thing. This is the photograph he had commissioned. And that is what the basis of the painting was, as you can see. Not exactly the same, but you can see it's the model. What else did Marchant say? He said, "Our worthy, noble, and heroic president has little of the grace of Apollo." Nice. "But when touched by some grand moving theme, the intense feeling and bold character beam from his manly features." So that's what he meant us to see here. And by the way, he put him in a white tie. Marchant said that Lincoln wore that at weddings. I can't imagine what weddings they went to together in the time that the painter was at the White House. Marchant hated Lincoln's usual look, the one that is so common. He said that black tie, right, that we all know, was like a sharp line, a gash. It severed the head from the body. It appalled me. So he did the only white tie Lincoln dressed for a wedding that we have. He was equally proud, the artist was, to show standing behind Lincoln a Statue of Liberty before there was the Statue of Liberty. Her white hand is trampling what Marchant called a riven chain to symbolize the ending of slavery. You know, it's interesting how in recent years people have debated the impact of emancipation. Did it really emancipate anybody? Didn't it require the African Americans to self-emancipate? Didn't it require the 13th Amendment? If you look at the images of Lincoln made after January, this is a month after emancipation, the artists thought that Lincoln ended slavery. Not just began to end slavery, but ended slavery. Well, the canvas went on view in Philadelphia that year. As I said to Keely when I met her to do the research for this talk about Schweizer, and I will get to Schweizer, I still haven't found any newspaper notice from the Philadelphia area that attests to the fact that it ever was displayed in Independence Hall. It came here, or to the original club. Well, how did it get so famous? Because it is one of the most famous of all Lincoln pictures. Well, it was another Philadelphian, this man, John Sartain, the famous engraver who issued an engraved adaptation just in time for Lincoln's 1864 re-election campaign, which of course the club supported all out. They were part of the campaign in literature and art. It clearly indicates that by the way, in this version, which also came out in '64, it says right on there, it is in the possession of the Union League. So at least by '64, we know it's here, and it's been here for 165 years, or 161. Some claim that the demand for the print grew so great because of promotional brochures like this. It's always interesting, you see Civil War prints, or I see them everywhere. How did they get purchased? How did people, did they go to the stationery store? Some people did. Did they got newsstands? Some people did. Or they got these brochures, these flyers, and they bought them on Amazon. No, they bought them through the mail. Another indication of how successful it was comes because it was copied by others. The copyright laws were not rigidly enforced, so you got this guy making a sloppy copy of the original. I know. An insult to Marchant and Sartain. He took the goddess of liberty out to disguise it. But that achieved popularity as well. And just think, little Otto Schweizer was all of 3 months old when Marchant packed up his brushes and easel and Henry returned to his unit and his doom. The records show, we're back in Europe now, that Otto grew into an active child, particularly adept at wrestling. Interesting, that's a field of athletics for which his future subject, Abraham Lincoln, earned quite a reputation of his own back in the New Salem and the Black Hawk War. It was said that even as a boy, Schweitzer was fastidious about his clothing, which kind of separates him from Lincoln, who wasn't fastidious about his clothing. In fact, I'll tell you one story because it comes from Carl Schurz, the German-American leader, whom Schweitzer would one day sculpt. So it's worth remembering that Schurz once saw Lincoln wearing a white linen coat of this variety during the summer of 1860. And Schurz remembered that the back of it was so darkened in spots by sweat stains, that it resembled a map of the continents of the world. So as a quaint but unique Schweitzer biography issued by a man named Ernst Jockers in 1953, when the sculptor was still alive, by the way, it recalled him as we said, a well-dressed but reserved child, friendless through school, another point of departure from the gregarious and magnetic and always popular Lincoln. So Schweitzer was sent to a music conservatory at first, where he learned the piano and fell in love with poetry. That's another Lincoln favorite, but yearned to take up what was then called the plastic arts, sculpting. As with Lincoln, conventional education had no way really to deal with such a restless, creative, and curious student. Lincoln became a voracious reader without much help from teachers. Schweitzer turned on his own to drawing and sculpture. Perhaps that's why the teenager abruptly quit the conservatory and became an apprentice in a sculpture shop run by a Parisian artist in Zurich. His father objected violently. There's another similarity. Lincoln's father objected violently, we think, to his ambitions to read, to learn, to advance himself, as his father thought his ambition was not to help him with farm work. And he only had one son, and then later a stepson to do that help. But his mother, Schweitzer's mother, as Lincoln's stepmother, supported his ambitions. Encouragement from one parent in both cases proved enough. So Schweitzer learned a good deal from his new mentor, but eventually he began progressing so quickly in sculpting that his teacher became kind of jealous and critical. So Schweizer left the studio before his formal apprenticeship ended and instead enrolled in the Zurich Industrial Art School. It was 1879. Schweizer was still only 14 years old. 16 years old. I just did the math. I wrote 14 years old, but it's 16. Graduating 3 years later, he headed to Dresden and entered the Royal Academy of Art. That's a test to get in. That's hard. There he learned under tutors committed to the art of what was called pure simplicity, advocated by 18th century sculptor Johann Winkelmann. So after a year, Schweizer was rewarded with the silver medal for foreign artists. He was Swiss. This was Germany. And with that, with getting the medal, he was excused from the second year of study. He was only 20, and he became an apprentice at the studio of a German sculptor named Johannes Schilling. And while he was there, he made this interesting sketch of the exterior of the studio, which I show you because it demonstrates, I think, very superior skills as a draftsman. So he had that gift too. From Dresden, the next logical step for education and inspiration was Florence, Italy. That's where he went, the same city where another future Lincoln sculptor, Daniel Chester French, had studied just 10 years earlier. They weren't contemporaries, but they were kind of close. French was, I'm going to do the math wrong again. French was 13 years older. In Florence, Otto's work improved more, and he became more prolific with a number of projects. I read that he also attended his first seance in Florence, an interest he had for the rest of his life. Why do I mention that? Because Mary Lincoln was interested in seances, and she compelled her husband to attend one of them in Washington, resulting in this taunting cartoon of the period, the Dark Seance Polka, with everybody, with musical instruments flying around so they couldn't play the polka. In fact, Mary was so committed to spiritualism that after her husband's death, she posed for a man named William Mumler, who was a spiritualist photographer, who convinced her that Lincoln's spirit had arrived in the studio in Chicago to take this picture, hovering reassuringly behind her. It's an extraordinary picture. Speaking of spouses, Schweizer married while in Florence and fathered his first son. But inspiring as the city was, work began drying up in Europe, and like many European artists before him, Otto and his family boarded a ship bound for the U.S. He landed in New York on September 24th, 1894. He was 31 years old, had no job and no commissions, but he was ready to reinvent himself as an American artist. Unfortunately, his arrival coincided with a steep economic downturn here in New York. There were no commissions to be had. Schweizer accepted the first job he could land, 6 months' work, and it wasn't a bad job, 6 months' work as a modeler, which means he did elements for the new Library of Congress building in Washington. I think one of the most beautiful buildings in the Capitol. And again, an eerie connection. This is his first American job. The Library of Congress sits on the site where Abraham Lincoln lived as a congressman in Mrs. Spriggs' boarding house. This magnificent building was a simple wooden boarding house for Whigs in 1847 and 48, and Lincoln lived on that site. Finally, Otto moved to Philadelphia, where he had the good fortune to be embraced by a patron for whom he produced a bust of his young daughter. And then he showed photos of these works to the Ketter Linus Lithograph Company on Arch Street. And there he won a regular job producing commercial art as an industrial designer. think of it, this sculptor who will eventually have one of the greatest commissions any sculptor could have, and we'll get to it, starts doing posters for the Fleischmann Wool Company and Keating's Bicycles here in Philadelphia. So he took to modeling clay adaptations of his drawings at his desk at night. He never went home. He held his designer job for 11 years without really becoming a noted sculptor at all. Adequately enough paid, but frustrated, unfulfilled, and no doubt a handful at home when he was at home, which apparently was very seldom. In fact, I presume his long absences, because he liked to work and do his own thing once the business day ended, is why his wife divorced him. Divorce is unusual. His wife divorced him and went back to Switzerland with their boy, who returned to Philadelphia only years later when the mother died. So Otto moved to a house on Franklin and Diamond Streets, found a new love interest right away, remarried, and then moved eventually to a new home on West Venango Street. All seemed to be going well enough, and then he really had a stroke of luck. The Ketter Linus firm went under. It was the best thing that could happen to him. He was 43, he had no job, he had a new house, a wife and a new son to support, a returned son to support, and he did have another child on the way. So at this defining moment, he understandably could have gone and gotten another commercial art job to keep the mortgage payments going. Instead, he decided it was now or never to become an independent sculptor. It's what he had wanted since he was a teenager. The remarkable thing is not just how long he had had to wait, but how quickly he now rose as an older guy just entering this crowded field with St. Gaudens and French and Borglum and all of these people with their head starts in the field. He got an assignment right away from the commissioner of the battlefield parks of Pennsylvania for his first truly publicly displayed piece, a simple but effective American eagle. And then an 8-foot-tall statue of President James A. Garfield, much in the news, again, if you're watching Netflix. This was done for Long Branch, New Jersey, where that president, like Lincoln before him, had succumbed to an assassin's bullet. Then came a statue of the minister-turned-Revolutionary War general Peter Muhlenberg, sponsored by the German Society of Pennsylvania, which Schweizer had joined very wisely because he got commissions from the members. Now they began pouring in. And they did have a German tinge to them because those were the patrons he was meeting socially. Baron von Steuben for Valley Forge, and another Baron von Steuben for Milwaukee. He did Molly Pitcher for Carlisle, and he did the aforementioned Carl Schurz for Philadelphia. Then the Civil War finally beckoned. A Civil War monument for the Colorado State Capitol in Denver, and then this, collaboration on the prestigious Pennsylvania State Monument on the battlefield of Gettysburg, honoring the 35,530 Pennsylvanians who had fought there, slated to stand on Cemetery Ridge, right near the spot where Lincoln had delivered the Gettysburg Address early in the sculptor's own lifetime, November 19th, 1863. Now, Schweizer was not the only sculptor invited to contribute the larger-than-life statues you see in the lower niches there. In fact, he was one of 4, and he didn't get to do favorite son George Gordon Meade. But as some of these public sketches show, he got to do some important pieces, and as you see here, they were widely publicized. General David McMurtry Gregg, General Alfred Pleasanton. Most important, he was asked to do the centerpiece, a 9-foot high statue of Lincoln the orator, just a few yards from where he gave the speech. By the way, he didn't know it was a few yards. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, has now discovered that it was really in back of that monument that Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. But this is not the Lincoln who waited anxiously for news from Gettysburg during those terrible 3 summer days, or the disappointed president who, after Lee had retreated south unmolested, said, "If I had led the troops at Gettysburg, I could have whipped them myself." He wasn't the commander-in-chief who told Pennsylvania's own General Meade that he was enormously distressed that he had not pursued the Army of Virginia further south. No, this was Lincoln, the orator statesman, and here is the statue. The man who came to Gettysburg months after the battle and interpreted the bloodshed and sacrifice there as the labor pains necessary for a new birth of freedom, where government of, by, and for the people would mean a country where the majority ruled at election time, where disgruntled states could not secede or revolt or riot when they were disappointed by the result, and where slavery no longer contradicted the original promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. This was the majestic though spiritual Lincoln, the Lincoln who inserted the words "under God" to his speech at the last moment, a story that inspired the deeply religious Schweitzer. Now, the interpretation, I'll show it you from another angle, also aligned very neatly with the latest trend in Lincoln sculpture that had changed direction under less noble circumstances, the onset of Jim Crow. Before 1900, as the Marchant picture reminds us, most artists and sculptors portrayed Lincoln as the Great Emancipator, signing the document that had begun the destruction of slavery. Or in the case of sculptor Thomas Ball and his now controversial Freedom Monument in Washington, actually raising an enslaved man from his knees to symbolize their freedom. By the way, this statue was paid for entirely by freed black Americans. I understand that it's not a perfect image anymore, but and a copy was taken down in Boston, but it's remained in Washington, interestingly. By the 1880s, Reconstruction was over, and the direction in art, where Lincoln was concerned, shifted to safer, shall we say, more universal ground, and began emphasizing Lincoln the statesman, kind of benignly. He wasn't necessarily liberating people of color. He was talking. He was an orator. And that began with the unveiling of Augustus St. Gaudens's Lincoln the Man in Chicago, unveiled by Lincoln's own grandson. The trend would continue, of course, and maybe reach the apogee with Daniel Chester French's Seated Lincoln, dedicated at the Lincoln Memorial in 1922 to show how far we had regressed. It was dedicated at a segregated ceremony in Washington, not only segregated, but a ceremony at which the earliest arrivals, who had been African American, were displaced by mounted police and moved into a kind of ghetto of seating without backs in the rear of the ceremony. That was the Lincoln Memorial. Even the casual Borglum statue for Newark had this kind of inviting air, non-controversial air. Schweitzer's Lincoln comes right at the beginning of this period. But it's not a Lincoln with his hand in his vest or sitting on a throne or a bench. It's a Lincoln actively engaging whatever subject we wish to interpret and infer. Freedom, union, equality. It's all there. And remember, when Union and Confederate veterans gathered at Gettysburg to mark the 50th anniversary of the battle and visit this new monument and this new statue, sectional reconciliation was the order of the day, not racial reconciliation, as emphasized during the days of Reconstruction. The President of the United States was Woodrow Wilson, who had grown up in a city that General Sherman had bombarded, Columbia, South Carolina, and behaved usually as if he had been wounded by a shell himself. Now he was the main speaker at the 1913 commemoration. And remember, Wilson had already resegregated the federal bureaucracy. 2 years later, he would screen Birth of a Nation at the White House, a far cry from Theodore Roosevelt's earlier White House dinner for black educator Booker T. Washington. On the positive side, what could be more appropriate for Gettysburg than the Lincoln who had consecrated the ground far above anyone's power to add or detract, who, despite the majesty of what he said there, always insisted that what the soldiers did there was more important. Schweitzer, I think, captured the mood and captured the evolving nature of Lincoln's reputation in 1913. Perhaps that's why the monument would not be Schweitzer's only Gettysburg commission. In the end, he would produce 7 statues for the battlefield, more than any other sculptor, in other places, evocative spaces like Culp's Hill and the Emmitsburg Road. Meanwhile, Schweitzer's career endured very nicely up until the late 1940s, a truly remarkable run for a man who had achieved artistic and commercial recognition so late in his career. And here's a point of difference. Unlike St. Gaudens and French, who really loved their own work, I must say the only time French doubted his work is when St. Gaudens criticized it. But after St. Gaudens died, Daniel Chester French didn't care what anybody thought. He knew he was the best. He got the best commissions. Schweitzer, I learned, thought he could have made his Gettysburg Lincoln even better. That kind of sets him apart. And as many of us know, because that's why we're here, he got his chance to do so 2 years later in 1915 when the Union League offered him $3,500, not bad in 1915, to produce another version for this club. Now, he would not resort to a mere reduction of the original. He wanted to rethink it. And he worked hard on the anatomy. He just rethought Lincoln. This is one of the amazing pieces that the Sirlins have brought here to the Union League, and now give us a roadmap for how the work was done, how this sculptor worked. French never drew, never sketched. He just used clay. Schweitzer is anatomical, and as you can see from the lines, he's mathematical as well. In the end, he crafted a magnificent variant to dominate a room dedicated to Lincoln's memory. But here is the model, which is now here. I was just amazed to be allowed to see this a few months ago when I visited. Here's another view of it. It's now in your collection. And it shows him giving the speech, but not with the gestures, not with hand outstretched, just at his side, gesturing very little. And Lincoln's law partner said Lincoln never and this was a common expression. It comes from Shakespeare. He never sawed the air with his hands when he spoke. That's from the advice to players, speak the speech, I pray you, from Hamlet. Never saw the air with your hands. Or as his law partner later said, Lincoln never spoke as if he was swatting bees. You know, that was another expression. He's self-assured. He's gesturing only lightly. The perfect image at a time, by the way, when armies were fighting to the death in Europe, in a war even more modern and deadly than our Civil War had been. And just a few months after the statue was dedicated here, the U.S. would enter the war to end all wars. Yet there's a gentle side to the statue as well. It was the right time because it was the 50th anniversary of Lincoln's great second inaugural address. So it was a perfect time to remember not only how the Civil War had started, but how it had ended, or had Lincoln wanted it to end, with malice toward none and charity for all. That's one man's interpretation anyway. Down in the League Library is correspondence between sculptor and club that testified to Schweitzer's hard work, but not his motivation. I've found very few records from sculptors who say, this is what I wanted to do. They want you to take from the piece what you feel is there for you to absorb. I can tell you one thing that Schweitzer felt, no disrespect to the Union League, but he thought he was underpaid. That's all right. Daniel Chester French thought he was underpaid for the Lincoln Memorial at $75,000. I've completed a little scale model of my new Lincoln, he alerted the club, by mid-July 2015. And this second plaster maquette is here in the club as well. Within months, though, complaining all the way to the bank, I guess you can say, the final version was cast by Achille and Edouard Bureau at their long-gone foundry in Allegheny West. It's really a local product, isn't it? It's still standing, at least as of 2022. It's now the headquarters of the Philadelphia Salvage Company. The completed Lincoln stood 7 feet 2.5 inches and weighed 800 pounds. I imagine it still does, right? It's not on Ozempic. It still weighs 800 pounds. The marble base, created by Vermont Marble, is another 1,500 pounds. So it's more than a ton. Good thing you have rock-solid floors in this building. The club expressed itself as profoundly grateful for its new Lincoln at the time, but that's not to say that it didn't receive its share of criticism at the time. A friend wrote to Schweitzer in 1917, this is part of the archives here, telling him, pay no attention to what your enemies say. People are jealous. After all, you get the contracts and you get the credit. They don't. So I imagine other sculptors said, I could have done it better. Also very common in just what I've examined of Lincoln art in the 50 years from his death to this period. From my point of view, Schweitzer actually got better as he went from older to old. His memorial to what were called the colored soldiers of all wars here in Philadelphia is a really terrific combination of the realistic and the symbolic, and a rarity for the 1930s when the U.S. Army remained segregated. Schweitzer's relief plaques of Sherman and Sheridan and Grant, I'm showing you some of the ones in place and some of the models, and Admiral Farragut and other Union military heroes, I think rank among the best sculptural portraits of any of those heroes. Maybe Schweitzer's only misfire was this piece, and not because of it lacked artistry. It's called Southern Mother. It's got a kind of saccharine lost cause orientation. Maybe enough so it was irredeemable, even with his artistic virtuosity. Except for this one piece, Schweizer did not ever rest on his laurels or compromise his pro-Union, pro-Lincoln sentiments. Schweizer died at age 93, about 12 miles west of his adopted city, in a nursing home in Media, Pennsylvania. He did earn an obituary in the New York Times, but I think it was less than he deserved. The truth is, if he is remembered at all, it's because of his Lincolns at Gettysburg and here in this building. And he's remembered mainly because the Union League, and more recently Founding Forward and the Sirlins too, never forgot the club's link to Lincoln. From the days of Marchant to the era of Schweizer and beyond. When Lincoln came to Philadelphia for the great Central Sanitary Fair of June 1864, he had the chance to glimpse an even earlier sculpture of himself. This one modeled from life by yet another Philadelphian, a man named William Marshall Swain. It was on view here, I think got here a couple of days after Lincoln did, because the sculptor was slow to finish it and pack it up in Washington. So he could have seen it, but he may not have. But he did get to visit and see, Lincoln did, the original Union League Club. He made sure to make a beeline for the Union League. And that's where he praised this organization because it was, and I quote, promoted in its formation by motives of the highest patriotism. And judging by your dedication to this beautiful statue, the exhibit that you'll see soon, and your overall devotion to Lincoln, obviously not much has changed in that devotion. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for Professor Holzer. Wonderful, wonderful talk. We have time for a few questions. Staff has microphones right here and over here. Just raise your hand if you have a question.
And if it's about Schweizer, I might ask Keely to help me if she's here. I hope she's here.
Yes, right here, Corey. Yep.
It's a question which, not necessarily would be politically correct, but you had spoken about how Lincoln was a great patriot, and he was, inspired by the highest ideals. But in the background of everything that was happening at that point, and I don't want to be politically correct, has he, in his words or in his writing, spoken about the effect of colonialism within the United States and North America upon the indigenous people?
That's a fair question. And I always answer it very forthrightly. Lincoln had almost zero sympathy for Native peoples. Why? Well, he knew very little about his family, but he knew that his grandfather and namesake, Abraham Lincoln, had been killed by a Native American in Kentucky, and that his father was about to be slaughtered with an axe when his older brother shot the Indian. So he grows up with this legend that Native peoples are dangerous. The only military experience he ever had was fighting in a little Indian war in Illinois. A Sauk chief named Black Hawk came back to reclaim lands he decided, and probably correctly, he was jilted out of by a phony treaty. All the young men, especially young men like Lincoln, who were running for the legislature, enlisted in the militia. And as Lincoln said, I never saw any live Indians. The only battles I had were with mosquitoes, who made him bleed. That's the only blood he shed. But he did see a battlefield. He was on burial detail. He was pretty horrified by what he saw. As president, Native peoples are kind of divided between North and South, especially in the West, tilting toward the Confederacy and alignment with Confederacy. One reason is they embrace slavery and don't see it as a political sin. And Lincoln is very tough. You read his annual messages, he talks about savages, he talks about keeping Indians in their settlements and in their contained areas. But he also had the most remarkable meeting in the White House with chiefs of many Native nations. His speech is, as recorded by a newspaper, was really patronizing. It was kind of like, me, white father, you hunter people, you should be farmer people. It was that kind of speech. But the fact that they're all sitting in front of him with their weapons and with their headdresses was a remarkable moment in Washington. And so I don't know, would he have changed? Probably not that much, but just being honest.
One more question right here, Corey.
I'll try to be shorter.
You mentioned that the statue that depicted Lincoln as the Emancipator, it had Emancipator along the plinth. Why was that controversial, or why is that controversial?
So the sculptor, with whom French studied in Italy, by the way, said that what he wanted to show was an enslaved person rising from slavery. And to Frederick Douglass, who gave the major address at the unveiling, it was all about a person of color kneel on his knees before Lincoln. And that granted black people no agency in their own quest for freedom. And of course, we know that black people left plantations, they came to military lines. Lincoln did not, as that statue suggests, wave a magic wand and everyone said, I'm free at last, and leave. You know, freedom still had to be achieved. He just gave it legal standing. And there are many objections still raised. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who has been the District of Columbia's representative in Congress for, 50 years. She's 87. She will not leave that seat, despite many entreaties that she retire, until that statue is gone. That's one of her goals. She wants it gone. My friend Edna Medford from Howard University thinks it should stay because it was financed by people of color. So, and in Boston, the mayor took it down. There was a copy in Boston, and no one knows where it is. It was taken down as if it were a Confederate statue. Can we have time for? We'll take it. Yeah, right? Try and find it. Do we have time for this one here?
Well, one last quick question.
So, in my graduate school degrees in American history, it was said that Lincoln really cared about preserving the Union, and he really wasn't opposed to slavery. It was everything he could do to save the country. What is your response to that?
My response is to believe him when he said, I have always hated slavery. I can't remember when I did not so feel. And some of the writings that misdirect us today and cause us, I think, to overinterpret represent Lincoln's trying to soften up a racist public, because very few people believed in racial equality in 1863. Most white people feared in an influx of black workers who would compete for jobs. And Lincoln stressed the Union. Of course he believed in the Union. He loved the Union. He didn't believe that democracy should be altered. But I think he had his chance and he took it, and nobody else took it. He wanted to do it, but some of his writings misdirect us so that people believed he was doing it only for the Union. When he signed the document, he said, this is the most important act of the 19th century. I want to wait till my hand has feeling in it from all the New Year's handshaking, so that when people look at the signature in 100 years, no one can ever say he hesitated. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Harold.